We'll just push them out of the way.
No problem. Take your time.
Just
Take your
we'll
time.
worry about them later.
Don't want to
Brad.
upset your microbiome.
I can even leave one for you if you'd like.
Thank you.
There.
That's a great transition point, because I think one of the central messages that Peggy's left us with is that what we're doing now is not working. And we know it's not working because here we are talking about how bad things are despite everything that we're doing. If we want to have a future state where we're not living with a crisis of antibiotic resistance, we need to think disruptively. Incrementally tweaking what we're doing is not going to get the job done. And as we think disruptively and transformationally, to me, there needs to be a central core principle that I fear we have not paid attention to in policy or regulations that deal with antibiotics. And that core principle is that antibiotics are different than all other classes of drugs, because only antibiotics suffer from transmissible loss of efficacy over time. That distinguishes them from all other classes of drugs. If you try to lump antibiotics in with other classes of drugs from a policy or regulatory perspective, you're going to focus on the wrong things and you're going to actually cause damage. And I'll give you some examples of that in a few moments. So from that core principle, I'm going to talk about 3 areas that I would like to see transformation in. The first is we need to do a much better job of protecting the antibiotics that we already have. Now, several speakers have mentioned antibiotics in animal feed. This is a national disgrace. There's no scientific debate here, so I'm not going to belabor this point. It needs to end. This is a political concern, and when we get the political will, it will end. I'm not going to say anything more about that now. We can talk more about it during the Q&A. More challenging to think about, I think, scientifically, is how do we prevent inappropriate antibiotic prescriptions in people? The traditional stewardship efforts, stewardship being the term we use to focus on giving the right antibiotic to the right people and not giving it when not necessary. Traditional approaches relate to education, what I would call nagging, local restriction efforts, and these are important things to continue doing, but really they only scratch the surface of the problem. This is putting a Band-Aid on the problem. This does not get to the root cause of why inappropriate prescriptions occur. If you want to deal with the root problem, why do they occur? It's simply fear. It's fear of the unknown. We as treating physicians do not in fact know what our patients have with certainty. We make our best guess, and that guess is haunted by the fear that we could be wrong. And that's what leads to this, what if it's bacterial? How much harm could one prescription do? It's the classic tragedy of the commons. And if you want to combat the tragedy of the commons in this circumstance, you need to deal with that fear. Everything else is putting a Band-Aid on the problem. How do we deal with that fear? Rapid diagnostics. We need technology. Relying upon asking people to behave differently in a sustainable way is not going to get the job done. That's the hardest thing to do in quality management. But technology can embed change. The technologies for rapid diagnostics are becoming available. And we need regulators and payers, especially payers, to help us push these technologies into the clinic so that doctors don't have the fear that creates the inappropriate antibiotic prescription. We need to hold healthcare systems accountable for implementing these technologies as they become available. Another thing we need to do is harness the power of economics. So I would like to see public reporting of antibiotic use across healthcare systems, so that we can implement pay-for-performance metrics. And systems in the lowest quartile of use will get a payment bonus. Systems in the highest quartile of use will get a payment penalty. This strategy has been highly effective at driving down hospital-acquired adverse event rates of a variety of types. And we need to seriously consider doing this as well, because it will also help us drive down overall antibiotic usage rates in patients. Now, I think most disruptively, and where you're going to run into the most difficulties at a regulatory level and in industry, is that we need to begin to recognize that how we label antibiotics has to change. The way we label antibiotics, unfortunately, accidentally, encourages inappropriate antibiotic prescriptions. So, as we've said, antibiotics are sort of a community property or trust because of this transmissible loss of efficacy. Every individual's use of an antibiotic affects the ability to use those antibiotics for everybody else. If I take a broad-spectrum antibiotic that can kill gram-negative pathogens that are highly resistant that I need because I don't have alternatives, but it also kills staph and strep that I have 20 other drugs to treat, and I give an indication to that drug to treat staph and strep skin infections, once that drug has that indication, the companies can market it for that indication. And marketing is what drives physician use of antibiotics like all of the drugs. So now, the company's marketing the drug, the vast majority of its use is to treat common staph and strep infections that I have many other options to treat, and I'm selecting resistance to the drug, and I can no longer use it to treat the gram-negatives where it's really needed. We need to begin to consider appropriate antibiotic use when we label antibiotics, and that's different than how the FDA labels all other drug types. There is no precedent for doing this with drugs, but I've already told you the core principle, which is that antibiotics are different than all other drug types, and we need to recognize that in policy. It may well be that the FDA doesn't have the statutory authority to consider appropriate use when it labels antibiotics, and if that's the case, then we need to go to Congress and get that authority. But we should begin a dialogue with the FDA to find out what they could do with current regulations and what the gap is so we can talk to Congress about filling it. Let me move on to the pipeline. How are we going to rekindle the pipeline? Because we absolutely do need new antibiotics. They are the most effective medications that we have in our pharmacopoeia. We have economic challenges. Antibiotics are a bad investment vehicle for companies, and we have regulatory challenges. I'm not going to talk about individual incentives because I don't have time. What I'm going to just generally say is that the traditional entrepreneurial business model for pharma to develop drugs does not work anymore for antibiotics. It is broken. And in the future, we're going to need to move much more to a public-private partnership model. Some companies are leading the way. I would say GlaxoSmithKline, for example, and Achaogen are already doing this. This is the future of antibiotic development in industry. Public-private partnerships, defraying upfront cost and risk, and allowing the public a much bigger say into which drugs will get developed, so that I stop getting flooded in the market with new skin drugs that I don't need any more of, and start getting drugs to treat infections I actually am running out of drugs to treat. Now, this will require new regulatory pathways. If you're going to focus on unmet need, that is not something industry has done in the past. We're going to need new regulatory pathways to make that possible. And we also need to continue the current efforts that are underway to reform traditional pathways, because right now I have to tell you it is very difficult to enroll patients into antibiotic trials in the United States. Very difficult, and that has to change. Finally, I'd like to sort of echo thoughts that Peggy introduced. All of our efforts to treat infections focus on killing the bug, and it's incredibly effective as a therapeutic. It saves lives to a degree that other drugs simply can't match, but it also drives resistance. So it's time for us scientifically to begin to transform, not to replace antibiotics, but to complement them, to take the pressure off them. Why do we have to kill the bug? This is a notion that dates back to a classic paper in The Lancet from Paul Ehrlich in 1913. You can trace the roots, if you want to treat infection, kill the bug, to this 1913 article. But maybe we don't have to kill the bug. Maybe we can disarm the bug so that it doesn't cause disease even if it's present without trying to kill it. Or maybe we can passively starve it of nutrients that it has to get from the host in order to grow in the host. Or use probiotics to outcompete it. Or let's not worry about the bug at all. Maybe we need to modulate the host inflammatory response. The signs and symptoms of infections that we experience as clinical disease are driven in many infections much more so by the host response to the bacteria than by any specific activity that the bacteria undertakes in our body. We can directly target host proteins and modulate that inflammatory response. All of these approaches will have much less propensity to select for resistance because we're not trying to kill the bug. Scientifically, we need increased funding in this area, and from a regulatory perspective, these new types of therapies are going to need new clinical development programs. They're not going to be developed in the traditional way that antibiotics are developed. And I would say, finally, we need to make sure that these are considered antibacterials so they can access legislative incentives that currently are focused on antibiotics that kill the bug. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Great.